Carter and Biden very much the same. The enemies were certainly inflation. Neither did much to combat it. They talked about it, but it was pretend like it's not here, or the voters are wrong. I don't think Biden was as well read as Jimmy Carter. Carter, you'd have to say, was one of our more intellectually curious presidents.
Now, I know that you've written extensively ranking each American president. Where do you rank Jimmy Carter?
Let me just start by saying the number I gave him was 29 out of 43. And George Bush was the sitting president at the time. So we've had since I published, several presidents coming in, about 4, I think. And I wouldn't change the grade. I can tell you why I do that. But let me just tell you, I had 6 criteria. People say, well, what's different about your book? People take polls all the time. Well, that's very true, and polls go up and down. But I gave them separate grades, like a student gets a report card. They get a grade in chemistry, they get a grade in French, they get a grade in something else, whatever. And I had 6 categories. So one was character. The highest you can get is a 5. One was vision, one was competence. And then how they handled the economy, how they handled national security, and how they handled what I call the mission of the United States, was to preserve and protect freedom, which gets us into great debates. Freedom where, freedom when, freedom from whom, whatever it was. I gave him 1 5, and that was in character, and I still stand on that. His lowest was in competence. He was a very sophisticated man, very well-educated man, and very intellectually curious. He did not work very well with people who were none of the above, which describes the U.S. Congress and certainly describes some of his political antagonists. Things he could focus on without having to persuade others, because he knew he was right, were few and far between. But the great example of that is the Camp David Accords. He didn't have to keep running back and forth. They were done in secret. He didn't have to justify it on the press. There were not any leaks that came out all the time. The way Biden sees somebody, everybody knows what was said off the record before their shoes hit the pavement. He did very well when he worked alone, and did very poorly when he needed cooperation of the Speaker of the House, of his own party. We can go into some of the reasons for that. Some of them were really illogical, some of them were personal.
Let's start by talking about Joe Biden. There's been some interesting comparisons between Joe Biden's presidency and Jimmy Carter's. You know, you rank presidents. Do you see those comparisons with inflation, chaos in the Middle East, economic problems? And Biden leaves the presidency incredibly unpopular. I know that Jimmy Carter lost in a landslide. So are there some interesting comparisons there?
Well, yes. We've had 3 one-term presidents in my life, the 2 you just mentioned, and George Herbert Walker Bush, who I think was a terrific one-term president. And those were the days we had short wars, and we won them. And he did try to work on the deficit, which got him in trouble with his own base. We tried to raise taxes to balance the budget. It was part of a long compromise. But Carter and Biden very much the same. The enemies were certainly inflation. Neither did much to combat it. They talked about it, but it was pretend like it's not here, or the voters are wrong. They don't feel it. They're wrong. Here were the numbers. Well, that was a mistake Herbert Hoover made as well. Personally, Carter was always an environmentalist and a conservationist. I mean, he was an outdoorsman. He was a farmer. He went canoeing. He went camping. He did a lot of things that some of our Eastern-oriented, Northeastern presidents have not done. And that came natural to him. He set aside lots of public acreage in Alaska. He took the view of, we are going to develop part of it, and we are going to develop oil at some point, and we have to preserve other things for future generations. So very much like Teddy Roosevelt in that regard. Biden was a late convert to climate change, and I think that's one of the things that helped do him in. When we're making great sacrifices for something they can't explain. It won't happen in their lifetime. That's a very hard case to make. And of course, they were interested in health care for personal reasons. They both had examples of cancer and other illnesses in their families. Both Carter's parents, both of his sisters, and I'm not sure about his brother. I think they all died of cancer. And Carter was pronounced cancer-free about 2 years ago. Everyone was astonished. But yeah, I see a lot of parallels. I don't think Biden was as well-read as Jimmy Carter. Carter, you'd have to say, was one of our more intellectually curious presidents, which maybe got him into trouble. He went off on some ideas that he had and weren't always fully baked, but you could always tell that his heart and his brain were in the right place, even if he didn't know quite how to resolve it. And again, people skills were not his best. He could do well with audiences, but sitting in a room with the speaker and congressional leaders, he didn't enjoy it, they didn't enjoy it. And he had other aspects of the presidency that appealed to him more.
He didn't seem particularly charismatic, at least watching him in speeches. Maybe you disagree with that.
No, I don't disagree with you at all.
How did he become a presidential candidate in the first place? It just seems like, as a bit of an outsider, I went to his presidential museum actually recently in Georgia. And I'm just like, how did this guy even become the Democratic nominee? Even that seems pretty extraordinary to me. I know that wasn't he a governor in Georgia, is that right?
Yeah, he was a one-term governor of Georgia, but at that time, Georgia governors could not run for re-election. Several things that happened could only happen maybe once in a century that a man like Carter would break through. We had Watergate coming right after Vietnam. And then we had, Gerald Ford was a very decent president, but we had some bungling with Gerald Ford as well on the economy again. His approach was, we had buttons called whip inflation now, and that was the Ford approach, spend less. Well, you had Watergate, you had Vietnam, you had a long series of presidents lying to the American people about things that they could see were wrong with their own eyes. And you had the scandal of Watergate. So you had a plethora of Democratic candidates. Everybody thought that after Watergate, it was the first presidential election since Watergate, that they would win. So you had many candidates. You may have had a dozen Democratic contenders. And none of them were seen as having presidential stature. Edward Kennedy did not run after thinking about running for a very long time. He later will run against Carter for the nomination in 1980, but he did not run in 76. So the anti-Carter vote, we talk about it, once you can get into the top rank, I'll talk about that too, they had to coalesce in the early primaries. And he put Iowa on the map, the Iowa caucuses on the map. He showed that if an unknown with low name recognition could win in a place like Iowa, he would get attention. And the early primaries shaped the results of later primaries, as we saw with others since then. He had an identifiable core. He was a Christian. He called himself a born-again Christian. Whatever that meant to non-Christians, he did have a big base. And many people from the churches in Georgia, they called themselves the Peanut Brigade. They chartered buses, or they hitchhiked, or they rented a car, and however they could get to Iowa for the final 3 weeks of the Iowa caucuses. They were unpaid. They followed Carter all around the country. They slept in church basements. They slept with Democratic volunteers. And they had an identifiable group of people they could get out to get in Iowa. That was the first challenge. If we could run him for governor of Iowa, it's not very expensive to do. It's a small rural state. Then by the time we get to the bigger places like California or New York, a lot of people would have made their minds up. Saying that he wants a government as good as the American people, and saying that he would never lie to the American people, may not have been believed in a way, but he said it, and he didn't have a reputation for corruption as a governor of Georgia. He had the Atlanta Constitution, which was shocked that he ran. The headline said, Jimmy Carter's running for what? But it was a very major newspaper in the time, and they did come around to him by the time he got the nomination. So Edward Kennedy, as you know, the biggest albatross around his neck was the Chappaquiddick accident in which a young woman died in his car. They're crossing a bridge, went off the bridge. He pulled it and pulled it and pulled it, and it was not there for him that year. None of the others, if I could go through who some of the others people who ran. Mondale started out as a candidate. He winds up Carter's running mate. Several senators in the Midwest who've long disappeared. My favorite in that group was Mo Udall, who came in second. He was a congressman from Arizona with a very salty wit. I don't even know if I could say some of the things in this interview, but he said he lost to Carter in the New Hampshire primary, and it was pretty clear Jimmy Carter was about to become a front runner. Udall said, "Well, the voters have spoken." Paused, and then he called him a 7-letter word beginning with B. And everybody laughed. That was typical Udall. Carter did not have charisma, which surprised me because he comes out of a rural, religious Southern tradition. They're famous for their preachers. We think about Billy Graham being the obvious one. There are many, many others. And that's where Clinton learned his oratory. Clinton was a much better orator than Carter was. Just as intellectually curious. But he was a much better speaker.
So he beats Ford in 1976.
Very narrow.
In a very narrow election. And obviously you mentioned Watergate. That was a huge scandal that overshadowed the Republican Party at the time. And as you say, the 1970s, particularly difficult decade for inflation all across the world.
Yes.
Carter himself, I mean, he's coming into the presidency during the Cold War, during, as I said, economic trouble. So it's not exactly an easy time to be president. How did he face up to the Soviet Union? Was he a weak character on the world stage?
I would say he came in naive and he became sophisticated very, very quickly. I didn't mention this earlier. We can talk about the American South. We talk about lots of things. In my generation, you think of segregation, you think of the March on Washington, you think of violence done by the Ku Klux Klan. And there were people like George Wallace who were taken seriously as a presidential candidate, particularly in the South. He got 13% of the vote in the general election. Unheard of. Carter came out of the Southern populist tradition in a way, the Southern liberal views about. He was a moderate on race. He was a conservative on taxes. He was not a big spender as governor of Georgia. He believed in giving everybody a fair shake. They came to Washington and he thought that all that we had to do with the Soviet Union was talk nice to them. He actually gave a speech at Notre Dame University, and he blamed the persistence of the Cold War to the United States' inordinate fear of communism. Imagine that. And it wasn't that they were gobbling up countries, and they were gobbling up major parts of Africa. They were fighting surrogates war. He came in thinking that he supported the Nixon-Kissinger approach, but he just thought they had to be nicer to Brezhnev. And there was an actual picture of Carter kissing Brezhnev on the cheek. He thought that's all we had to do. Well, and within a few weeks of the Soviet invasion a few weeks of Carter's talk that I just quoted, our inordinate fear of communism, the Russians invade Afghanistan. He was absolutely shocked. And you would have never seen that far a reversal of any president on foreign policy or budget or anything else. I would say at least 25% of the arms buildup that we credit Ronald Reagan for began in the latter years of the Carter administration. Most of them were continued by Reagan. Some ideas did not work, like not going to the Olympics. Now, either you cancel the Olympics and you put pressure on the other allied countries to boycott the Olympics and stand by you, or you grit your teeth and you participate. I mean, most of the free world participated in 1936 games, even though they were in Berlin and we knew what was going on. We didn't know everything. We knew what was going on on Hitler's side, at least. The Holocaust hadn't started yet. But some countries have been invaded already, or unearthed. All Carter did with that was punishing our athletes. And they had trained in some cases for over a dozen years to be good enough to go to the Olympics, and that was with the. But yes, he did start arming the dissidents in Afghanistan, and he did get his Mideast peace late. I mean, the Sadat was trying to get someone to negotiate with when Carter came in, and nothing happened during the Ford Nixon days. Although the Egyptians did ask the Egyptians did ask the Russians to withdraw from Egypt. That happened in the Ford years, but nothing else happened. And Carter decided that he would use his biblical faith to try to talk to both Begin and Sadat about peace in the Middle East, and it's the only real treaty we have to this day between an Arab nation and Israel. Maybe he had something right. I mean, he would talk to both of them separately. They weren't talking to each other for a long time, almost 2 weeks. And he would talk about these biblical towns like he would talk about towns in Georgia, like he was running for office again. I mean, he really thought he was very much aware of the Old Testament, particularly, and Jesus' life. And he tried to get that across, that he had another ingredient to bring. He understood it was more than geopolitics. It was a historic area for three religions, and he was going to put that on the table. It worked, and Sadat was a brave man. He wound up being assassinated by one of his own countrymen within 2 years of that. It did stick. But that's about it. But yes, his attitude toward the Soviet Union was very naive, and he overcompensated in the end. He made it easier for Ronald Reagan because defense budgets already start going up at the end of the Carter days.
So was that his greatest success, the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt?
Yes. I would add a few others, but his greatest single success, and longest standing success, was the Camp David Accords. A lot of people laughed at Carter when he said that he would link American behavior and American friendship to humane treatment for political prisoners and human rights as an issue that we would look at when we look at a nation, see whether they were hostile or friendly toward the United States. We had tolerated too many one-party dictator states where we might have been able to have a democracy in other places earlier. And we bowed down to too many tyrants because they were against the Soviet Union. Well, there was a rationale to that philosophy that he tried to test and reject. But by making certain concessions on our part on trade and other things contingent on a nation's ability to respect human rights of its neighbors and its internal dissonance, he was onto something. It's something Reagan used very effectively. There was something called the Helsinki Accords, and Carter negotiated that. And that became a club that Reagan was able to use to extract Soviet Jews from Russia. Freedom of travel, freedom of choice, freedom of where we want to live. If Russia's such a dreamland, why do they want to come here? Maybe they should have a choice. And a lot of these people are not welfare recipients. They're not trained in your country. They're doctors, lawyers, engineers, you name it. And they have a right to raise their children as you and I would like to raise ours. Reagan brought this up every single time. And he was very generous in sharing credit, I would say. He would say that Jimmy Carter was onto something.
Okay, so we've talked about Carter's limited success. Let's talk about some of his failures. Or some people would say they're not failures. I know that if you read the New York Times today, they love Carter. They say he's a peacemaking president. The left, they adore Carter, and they say that a shot was never fired in anger under his presidency, and the things that are blamed on him are unfairly blamed on him. So let's talk about Iran. Let's talk about the Panama Canal. Let's talk about some of these other foreign policy decisions that he made. How much blame can we put on Carter for some of these crises that he faced in his presidency?
Well, many presidents had terrible crises in trying to figure out how to deal with terrorism. The word entered the English language around the time of the Munich Olympics, 1972, when the German wrestling team was slaughtered. And then we saw again the Achille Lauro episode where an American sightseeing ship was hijacked, and the European governments let the perpetrators go. We have a lot of this trouble all the time. Carter believed in turning the other cheek, but he never responded. Like, what happens if the other fellow doesn't want to turn the other cheek? The other fellow just wants more in your country. He was late in coming to that. Iran was a time bomb that many people thought would go off at any point. I mean, the Nixon administration followed Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. They all followed the same strategy. And it was to basically back a strong man in the region who would trade with us and to some extent open up the country to have somewhat free press. There was censures, but better than, certainly it was more open than now, to emancipate women. The Shah pushed that very hard. It drove the clerical class absolutely crazy. That was one of the reasons they hated the Shah. He believed in sending young people for training in the West and then coming back to Iran. And the more the mullahs and those Iranians who called themselves students at the time, we have some idea that they weren't. We had some of that before. At least they weren't all students. It is a very planned episode, and it was not. I guess the last person surprised by it was Jimmy Carter. I mean, there had been a number of intelligence reports fearful of our personnel, fearful of this, fearful of that. And then what does he do? Having criticized Nixon's policy toward Iran, he spends his first New Year's Eve as president, 1977, in Tehran, toasting the Shah. When we had this political prisoner who was given asylum in Paris, named in southern France, Khomeini, was broadcasting on a transistor radio all through the Middle East in Arabic, talking about death in the United States and jihad and all of these things. He missed a lot of the warnings. But then once the episode happened, I know this does not sound very, warm-hearted of me or others who will say it. I'll say it though. He made the hostages the number one issue in the world, not American interests, and not standing tall. And they sensed that. Henry Kissinger said it well. I mean, why is it that there are no Soviet hostages taken ever anywhere? They wouldn't dare test them. They know what will happen to them. But everybody seems to test the United States. And this is the man who was rightfully accused of, let's say, coddling the Shah. And he's saying that, why are there no Soviet hostages in the world? Well, maybe Jimmy Carter needs to act a little stronger. Whether the accident that happened in the desert, where our planes couldn't fly and helicopters were flying into each other, whether that was a mistake done or resulted through budget cuts, or whether unfortunate set of circumstances with the training of who knows. But that was such a prominent defeat for the West on television. I don't know. The Panama Canal is back in the news, and it split people in both parties then like now. Although I don't know anybody on the Democratic side that wanted to hang on to it, or even now that wants to give it up. But in the Republicans, there was a split. There was a sense that anti-Americanism would grow in this hemisphere. It's just giving Castro and his allies in Nicaragua and Venezuela and other places that have become trouble spots something to pick at as an example of colonialism. And Reagan had a very famous debate with William F. Buckley Jr., which you may have seen, and I urge some people to listen to it, on the Panama Canal. And Reagan's view was very strong that we built it, we paid for it, it's ours, and not an inch of it is going to come out of American hands. And of course, it was done before he became president, and he chose not to open that one up again. Buckley took the view that there was a thing as national pride, and the United States had been perceived as a great colossus of the hemisphere for a very long time, and coddled other kinds of dictators, whether they be in Cuba or the countries I just talked about, and that it was a chance to establish some goodwill and develop a sense of capitalism and nationalism in these nations under an American umbrella. So, but yes, Jerry Ford had asked for the treaty and couldn't get it going. Carter asked for the treaty, the same two treaties, and Republican minority leader Howard Baker, Senate leader, helped him pass it. The one significant legislation that Carter passed with bipartisan support. So, however you stand on the canal, as a divisive issue, it had its roots in the Ford and Carter administration.
So Carter essentially governed over an America that was humiliated on the world stage. Is that your view? That during Carter's presidency, America appeared
Those things
weaker?
happened when he was president. I don't think he favored them. I don't think he understood until the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan what that meant. But even into old age, he would boast at certain international meetings that Fidel Castro was a friend of his. Really? Then why don't you ask him to stop killing his people? Why don't you ask him to start opening up the jails and stop making it a crime to go to mass on Sunday and all the things that were happening in the height of Fidel? He never bothered to lecture Fidel publicly. He was perfectly capable of lecturing other American presidents publicly. Even after he was president, he was on this pogo stick, if you want. But he didn't favor it. He did not want a weak America. He wanted America to be a different kind of example than Reagan had in mind. Reagan's notion about freedom and a city on a hill. He had a similar notion, but also a very left-wing notion where there was a stronger role for government. And a lesser role for the public to decide things for themselves. He was very heavy on regulation, which did not help the economy. To his credit, I said there were two things that I would say. One, we talked about Camp David. He was persuaded that if we could deregulate the airlines and get the government out of having to approve of every small technical thing they had to do, prices would go down. Training would go up. More people would want to be air traffic controllers. More people would want to take aviation as a career, and it wouldn't just be a transportation vehicle for the well-born and rich. And that's his main domestic policy. He had some other things that had incentive basis to them. He might have had a happier time.
Before we get on to his defeat in 1980, I want to briefly talk about his domestic policy. We've talked a lot about foreign policy. He was the president who put solar panels on the White House. He was the president who saw a huge amount of inflation, particularly oil inflation, and that was accelerated due to the crisis in Iran. So how do you rate his domestic?
Well, let me tell you, he gave the American people lectures that it's our fault. It's not his fault. He asked to lead the United States. He said he had a vision. And then 2 years in, I'm talking about what people refer to as the molest speech. It's all our fault. We're spending too much money. We're using too much gas. And that we have to get used to an age of scarcity. Well, that's not the American way. The American way is go out and explore. Go out and find new markets. Go out and untap raw materials elsewhere in the world. This is behind some of the discussion now about Greenland. And I was quite shocked to read over the weekend. The height of World War II, Churchill and Roosevelt were discussing whether we should invade Greenland. And the issue was not that we wanted to annex Greenland. We wanted Hitler not to have access to those natural resources. Very interesting. Some of the reasons that it might be attractive to many nations now, besides the nation that owns it. I was amazed. Even 50, 80 years ago, they were talking about that in Greenland. Carter was the first one who said, we're just going to live without these things. We're going to have to accept a more Puritan lifestyle, maybe. We're going to have to be frugal. Instead of ordering drilling elsewhere in the world so we can keep American homes and factories lit and working, we should lower the thermostat to 55 degrees Fahrenheit and have everybody walking around with the kind of sweater I'm wearing now, except I'm wearing it in January and not into September and other times of the year. He tried that with his energy policy. This change human behavior. Well, hopefully we can. Hopefully we're a better species than we were, and hopefully we learn by past mistakes. But you need the government to allow permitting and exploration to go on. He got it in transportation. He didn't get it in many other things. I don't think he understood why businesses were leaving states. First states, they were leaving northern states and midwestern states because the South had lower taxes. And then they were leaving the South to go to Asia and South America and making our goods for a lot less, a lot cheaper. I don't think he ever figured that out. Maybe I'm wrong.
So he gets to 1980, the end of his term, and he runs again for president. And he faces a Democratic primary, but he obviously succeeds and then goes on to be crushed by Ronald Reagan. Now, Jimmy Carter said, I think after the election, that if it wasn't for the Iran crisis, he would have won that election. Do you agree with him?
Maybe I agree with him 30 to 40% of it. Inflation had a lot to do with it. The hostages as an issue were the main issue by the last week or month of the campaign, put it that way. You can never catch a break on inflation. So you had inflation and the hostage crisis going on at the same time. And he gave lots of speeches, but nothing ever got better. The Iranians seemed to love to torture him, and so he wasn't standing tall. And, of course, the left in the Democratic Party was upset with him because they wanted scarcity. They wanted rationing. They weren't at all minding the fact that people were waiting in line for gas. Maybe it would reduce consumption. I would add, if you go back and look, every American president who was challenged, every incumbent president who was challenged for his nomination for re-election did lose in the general election that followed. Lyndon Johnson chose not to run. Obviously, he was fearful of losing that election, if not to Nixon, then to another Republican who might do well, maybe even an earlier Ronald Reagan, maybe. George Herbert Walker Bush, he had a threatening scare by Pat Buchanan. Pitchfork Pat, who now is seen of as the prophet of the MAGA movement. So Harry Truman, he had a very bad inflation at home after World War II had ended, with strikes every couple of weeks in another industry, and he had an endless war in Korea. And several Democrats tested the waters, and he too, like Johnson would later, chose not to run. In Carter's case, it was very peculiar that Kennedy would pick 76 against the president of his own party and leave the field open 4 years earlier. I mean, Chappaquiddick was still there, but why did it matter less in his mind in 76 and earlier? But it was a fiercely fought fight. And Carter had to give it everything he had. And, of course, Reagan picked up on some of the issues Kennedy had made, not the economic issues, not the hit Carter from the left, but the lack of leadership, the lack of vision, the lack of constancy, reversals on the Soviet Union, reversals on drilling, reversals on his approach to the Shah, and then his approach to the hostages. So I would say Reagan would have won. Had there not been a hostage crisis, I think the economy would have done Carter in. Third thing he did, but I don't think this is done intentionally. Carter appointed the most conservative director of the Federal Reserve we ever had, in Paul Volcker. And Volcker believed that you deal with inflation by having cutting the spending, balancing the budget, and squeezing out inflation over several periods of years, and then it would fall. Well, it was working, but Carter didn't want to suffer the recession. So Carter kind of order the tap turned on as the Volcker experiment was working. Well, so what happened? Reagan reappoints Volcker, and Reagan comes up with the line to tough it out, stay the course. If you're willing to do it, I'm willing to risk my second term, that I will get this down. And Volcker and Reagan did get it down. So I would say to Jimmy Carter, there were a lot of other things working against you, but had you had a victory, had you were able to rescue the hostages, or had you been able to bring down this government, we're still saying that about Iran, by the way. I mean, you say the same argument about Obama, that there were a real chance in the Arab Spring to say, well, you're not Arabs, but you're in the neighborhood, you're Persians, and you have an oppressed group of dissidents too, and one of you get engaged. No, never done on Obama, and it never done on Carter. That we're not into bringing down governments, no matter how heinous, which makes you an apologist for all kinds of autocrats in the world, as he was in the end toward Fidel Castro.
Yeah, so he leaves the presidency, and for more than 40 years, he has this very, very long post-presidential career. He dies age 100, the longest living president. Now, the New York Times and all these other liberal newspapers would say he was a fantastic post-president. Post-presidential career. He was helping humanitarian aid all over Africa, and he was involved in all sorts of charity and human rights and all of this stuff. So he was just brilliant. But there was also controversies that you mentioned. So he met with leaders of Hamas. He met with Assad. He was very critical of Israel. Whatever you think of the issue, he was far more critical of Israel than he was of Hamas, for example. So what do you make of his post-presidential career?
Well, first of all, one of his books, he actually accused the Israelis of practicing apartheid. And he was asked why they were Arabs sitting in the Israeli Knesset after practicing apartheid, and why there were so many Palestinians in the country. There were an equal number of Palestinians as there are of Jews in Israel. He chose to ignore what was inconvenient, in a way. The biggest controversy he got into as the next president, you haven't mentioned. I know you would have. Korea. I mean, he was trying to undermine a plan that the Carter administration, the Clinton administration was advancing, to the point where you feel sorry for the North Koreans by asking in public how many presidents run your country, and who has the final word. And we thought we had a deal with Clinton, and the former president is showing up in our Capitol offering a better deal. Is he running again? He's allowed to. What's the story here? A lot of his ideas, I would say, were not fully baked. Some of them were funny, that he winds up catering to the trendy left that gave him so much trouble when he was both Georgia and running for president, because he was considered too conservative for the Democratic Party when he ran for president among the left. And they divided them to several candidates. And of course, Kennedy was the left's darling, so you kind of wonder about some of this. Okay, as an ex-president, as a humanitarian, you have to give credit where credit is due. We've seen this a little earlier in another president, Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was not a success as president, an outright failure. I can't think of anything positive that came out of that, except we had 4 years without American troops anywhere in the world, which, given our record lately, was something not to sneer at. And he was a Quaker, and maybe he was a much more religious Quaker than some of the other Quakers who run for office, particularly Nixon. That said, it's a good idea to eradicate some of the diseases that he's talked about in recent days, or they have been mentioned in recent days. It's a good idea helping the poor learn how to develop skills. If the conservative argument was always, we don't just hand them welfare, we go back to the Bible, and you have teaching a man to fish is more important than giving him the fish, and if he's giving them skills, and they're getting houses and they're getting jobs, training through that and other things. A lot of Republican organizations, a lot of Republican politicians have participated in Habitat for Humanity and some of the things he's done. Also, to his credit, we didn't talk much about the early years. He started his career by going under the school board, and he decided that there are other ways he could help improve Georgia education. They had some of the worst grades in the country in terms of what children were learning and at what pace. He decided, well, I can do so much on the school board, but the legislature writes the budget, so why don't I run for the legislature? So he runs for Georgia is still a very backward state. You have Atlanta, then you have the rest of the state, and Atlanta was not one of our leading commercial and cultural centers that it has now. We can go back about why that happened later. I'm not crediting him for all of that. I'm giving him some of it. But he runs for senator, and it's discovered by investigative reporters that the election to him was stolen, and it was stolen in a very Chicago-type way. It was called the graveyard vote. People tended to vote in the order of which their obituary ran in the paper. So they had a cartoon running of these people checking in the cemetery, 7001, 7002, 7003. And he pointed out he had the resources to take this to court. Most people don't. And he was a very wealthy agri-farmer by the time he ran for president. And he could appoint strong attorneys. And the courts proved that he had been stolen the election. And they forced a recount. And at that point, he was a hero. All kinds of reformers, not only in his district, but all over the South and all over the country. Why do I say that? Well, after the Bush-Gore debacle of an election with the butterfly bullets and everything else, they had a 5-person committee look at election reforms. They were all former government officials. It was chaired by former Secretary of State Jim Baker, who had also been Reagan's chief of staff. Carter wrote it with the Republicans. He said, there's nothing wrong with carrying an ID card. Fraud has been committed against me. He must have written about 30 books in his time in office, and his best book is about that campaign and how easy it is to steal an election, and people's vote has to count, and without their vote they have nothing in a democracy. Well, all right, so he could call an issue, sometimes on the merits of the issue, not on the merits of which interest groups lined up before it or against it, or how the liberals think of me, or how the conservatives think of me. On some issues, he could do that beautifully. And this is an example. He was not their friend of same-day voting registration and all the stuff we've been hearing. And it comes up again in 2017. So I would say, as an ex-president, he's probably the greatest of our time. I mean, Herbert Hoover was a much older ex-president when he began to be an ex-president. But he was an orphan, and he founded the boys' clubs and the girls' clubs, and he provided, I can't tell you how many millions of dollars in today's money in scholarships for people who didn't have parents, or people who had been adopted, or people who just couldn't afford tuition. He was a government cutter. He's the one commission they haven't mentioned. A lot of the even the conservative press are saying, well, God bless President Trump. He's not going to do any better about cutting the size of government than the Grace Commission did under Ronald Reagan. They never mentioned the Herbert Hoover Commission under Harry Truman, and they were called back under Dwight Eisenhower. They cut billions out of the federal budget, and they reorganized a lot of departments. They sent a lot of bureaucrats packing. They haven't talked about it because it was such a success under him. And of course, Thomas Jefferson holds the record of another kind. How many presidents actually go out and build a brand new university out of nothing? And in its first century, it's beginning at the time. It was beginning to rival all the Ivy League colleges in the country. State-supported school on the cutting edge of research and teaching, respected all over the world. I mean, that's not a bad thing to have as an ex-president. In fact, Jefferson put that on his tombstone. He never put on the tombstone that he was President of the United States. Fascinating. It says, here lies Thomas Jefferson, on the dates, author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. That's what he was proud of. Being president was sort of like jury duty. Someone's got to do it, and I'm more confident than the alternatives are. But somebody can't stand a university. Somebody can't disestablish a religion as strong as the Anglican Church was in Virginia in his day, and somebody can't take on the British Empire with a couple of ragtag army personnel. So, yes, he was one of our best ex-presidents in a lot of ways. Some of his people are hoping that his grades as an ex-president will improve his grades as president. But the reason a lot of us respect Carter, I mean, I thought he was a bad president at the time. I didn't think he was the kind of person that could lead us through those issues. But he had an extraordinary sense of intellectual curiosity. A lot of ex-presidents had that. A lot of presidents had that. Sometimes they fail, sometimes they succeed. His mind was always working, he was always active. There wasn't a topic that he couldn't try to discuss and learn more about in his 4 years in office. Again, the people skills, the competence level, the people he appointed. But he did do a number of important things in that. And I mentioned the Human Rights Initiative, which other presidents were quick to use to their advantage and our advantage as a nation. He did keep the country scandal-free. We didn't have any Monica Gates. We didn't have any Watergates. We don't have any question. He had a brother he could have well pardoned. He had a brother who was trying to sell weapons to Libyans. He didn't pardon him. I don't know what happened to Billy Carter. Then he started to sell, beer and cash in on Jimmy's name all the time. Sell people tickets to tour a house that was an empty or wasn't even the Carter house, and all that kind of stuff. Petty stuff by modern times. Well, Libya was not a petty issue at the time. I don't know how he had access to these weapons. We never talked about those things. And if you're trying to inculcate values into young people are pretty clever. If you're telling them not to do things, you're doing them all the time. You're giving them lectures on quitting smoking and staying away from alcohol, and you come home drunk every night. They get the lesson. And, if you practice what you preach, no matter how corny it sounds, they will get that lesson too.
Yeah, well, I have to say that reading a bit about American political history after the Second World War, the amount of corruption, and before I'm sure as well, the amount of corruption there is just incredible, particularly under someone like Lyndon Johnson, just totally corrupt. People remember Watergate, obviously, but the rot goes back far deeper than that. And, fair play to Jimmy Carter. He did, as you say, he wasn't corrupt in that way. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
Alvin, for joining us. Really appreciate your time. A very fair, I think, assessment of Jimmy Carter, both good and bad.
Thank you for watching this video. If you want to watch more content, please subscribe to our new GBN America YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.